Hi, everyone. We are going to begin now. So first, welcome to everyone for making it to this session. We are excited to hear many of you over the next 1.5 hours. So uh, before we begin and we hand it over to Savitha, who's our speaker for today, we want to just introduce what this is all about. You may have got a sense from the description, but just to give you a sense of what Pedagogy Talks is about, how it came up, and what we are trying to achieve through it. So, Pedagogy Talks is a discussion forum that came up as a sort of collaboration between three of us. So, there's me, and I'm part of a group called Aina, and we sort of try to communicate critical educational perspectives and do workshops on educational sensitization. And there's Aishwarya, whose video is on, so I guess you can see him, and uh, he co-runs something called the English Researchers Collective at Jamia Millia. And there's Deeksha, who is a faculty, just yeah, who's faculty at I'm so sorry, I just got a distraction. Yeah, who's faculty at Zakir Hussain College in Delhi University. So the idea of Pedagogy Talks is to just sort of generate and curate reflective conversations on teaching. And we, are exploring different formats. So one of the formats that we have right now is where we invite somebody who may have been associated with school education or college education or even non-formal education or pedagogy in sort of other spaces, and we ask them to sort of reflect on their experience, maybe reflect on a particular problem or a theme, and through that we generate sort of a conversation. To sort of introduce a little more, I'm going to hand it over to Aishwarya. So, Aishwarya, could you just tell us a little more?
Thanks, Shayan. I just wanted to add that it also came from our experience, a collective sort of a realization that there's such a lack in terms of discourse on pedagogy, and especially as young teachers, when we go into teaching, there wasn't much, sort of a discussion on what pedagogy is. We had our own sort of methods and ways of going about teaching, but and of course, I mean, if we talk about our own credit or how we sort of see pedagogy being valued or recognized, what qualifies you as a teacher is just an exam, and we sort of wanted to also create conversations from the students, and from practitioners and from people who are actively doing things but not necessarily represent at the level of discourse, and so on and so forth. So that was also something that was one of the driving forces, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation where Savitha is going to talk about the self in pedagogy. And Diksha, if you want to add something.
Hi, everyone. Just like Aishwarya and Shayan have already mentioned, I think all of us felt a deep lack of conversations around teaching methods. Oftentimes, even today, um, teaching, when we are talking about teaching, I think it all, at least in my circumstances, it all comes down to digital literacy, how apt, how we are using the tools, digital tools for teaching, but nothing more than that, right? So when the three of us got together, our main idea was to generate different and diverse conversations around pedagogy, and also to learn from not just from the speakers but from all the participants. I think that's also a key takeaway. Even if we are organizing these sessions, it is not meant it's not meant to instruct, right? It's more of a community exercise, so that when we go back to our classrooms, we apply some of the things that we learn from you as well. Yeah, so I think that's that's how I think.
Thanks, Diksha. Just to add on something, before you know I introduce Savita, that so far, we have had 5 sessions before this, and all of these sessions have had people from formal educational spaces, and our sort of the reflections that we have had as a result have been based on formal educational spaces. But as Aishwarya said, we think that there is a much sort of bigger conversation on pedagogy that all of us need to connect to. And it's great that, the people on this call are also from different spaces, whether it's school education or college education or nonprofit or activist spaces, or even other education initiatives. And we want the conversation to be wide ranging and learn from each other and see how to apply some of these ideas to our spaces. So just to introduce, Savita. So Savita is the co-executive director of Samvada, an organization working to empower youth from vulnerable communities of Karnataka. And, Savita is going to tell us more about the work that she's doing with Samvada. And Savita's PhD work involved understanding how women from socially marginalized communities navigate state welfare hostels. And in this session, Savita is going to talk about the self as text, engaged pedagogy in the non-formal classroom. And just like a little sort of context for why we also thought that this is an important issue to talk about, I think in formal educational spaces, I mean, all 3 of us are organizing this. We're part of higher ed spaces. And today there is an increasing conversation on the self, but it's more in terms of, how do you contextualize the syllabus or the curriculum, right? And how do you create student-centered or learner-centered classrooms? And often there, what is confusing is that, I think the focus is more on how do you make the content more relatable to students, rather than really thinking of students as a site of knowledge production and knowledge generation. So that's something that we think needs to be explored more. And the other sort of debate, I guess, that we are having, again, like my awareness is mostly in the higher ed space, but about how the self is also this complicated terrain, so to speak. And often we have students saying that, okay, I had to share a bunch of life experiences, even traumatic experiences. What's the point of it? Like, it felt like it was just so ungrounded as an exercise when we talk about the self in classrooms. So as teachers, often, maybe we are not thinking enough about how do we exactly think of the self in the classroom, or think of the personal story in the classroom. So to explore all of that and much more, Savita is going to be addressing all of these things. So Savita, now please, you can start. Just a little thing about logistics. I mean, one, please keep yourself on mute through the session. And also, Savita's going to speak for 30 to 40 minutes. Please note down your thoughts and questions. And after Savita completes, we are going to just listen to as many of you as possible. We'd like to hear about your reflections, comments, and questions.
All right. Thank you, Shayan, and thank you, Aina, for doing what you do. I think for many of us invested in education, Aina has been this interesting space because you've been curating a lot of education research in more accessible ways. So I'm glad to be here. Okay, so I'll get down to the talk. I've structured this talk into 3 sections, and the first will actually be a set of clarifications about what I mean by the self, non-formal, and engaged pedagogy. In the second section, I'll talk about specific ways in which the self can actually be used. And the final section will be about a set of cautions that we can exercise as educators when we think about the self as text. And I'm glad Sayan and Aishwarya both spoke about the formal, non-formal difference, because I wanted to begin by that. Although I've said non-formal classroom, I think the personal story is a powerful tool in building the sociological imagination of young people across sites of learning. So the specific context that I work in and draw upon is somewhat not non-formal, because these are not colleges or universities. However, there's a very structured learning process, and young people are also in certain cases being certified in specific professions. So I think this formal non-formal distinction itself may not be something that we should lay too much weight upon, is what I wanted to clarify. So why I'm saying this is because the personal story or the self as text can be powerful in different learning spaces, perhaps in different ways. Having said that, next I would like to clarify what I mean by the self. What I mean is really the self as a sociological being, along with being a emotional, psychological person. It's about learning to recognize how one's life opportunities, possibilities, and vulnerabilities are a consequence of larger social political realities and histories, be this of caste, gender, class, religion, regions that one comes from, sexuality, and the ableist world order that we occupy. So really, like the social world and how that has made me who I am. I think that connection is where we are talking about the self, and not self as an abstract philosophical sort of reality, but the self as a grounded self who's being shaped by your experiences. So I think this talk is sort of going to sort of, what do I say? Um, like navigate these two things, the self and the social world, constantly as we talk, because the point is to understand the connections between the two. So how does one come to understand the social world? So when we teach, like say, social theory, or we are teaching feminist theory or whatever, like one is you're reading a set of books, you're listening to lectures, you're reading fiction, maybe you're watching movies maybe and discussing it. And there are various ways to understand the world out there, to understand to like class analysis, gender analysis, etc. But I think there's another level of sensitization when you begin to realize that the social world is not only out there, but it has shaped who you are and continues to do so. This is not to say that, it's a rigid thing and you can't be anything beyond what your identities dictate. That's not the point of it. But to recognize how you have been shaped is also powerful, because it can enable many things for young people. Okay, so now I move to the next phrase that I've used in the title of the talk, which is engaged pedagogy. Sayan, just tell me if I'm going too fast or if the overall pace seems all right. I can.
I think it's okay. In case anybody's finding it more difficult to follow, you can just put it on chat so that we can just be alert. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's also a little more difficult online because you're not seeing people necessarily. So it's useful to hear if anyone has something to say. All right. Okay. So that's really what I mean when I say engaged pedagogy, right? Like engaged pedagogy as enabling people to realize who they are vis-a-vis social realities. So Bell Hooks writes about engaged pedagogy, and she writes about it actually in the context of universities and structured formal sites of learning, as really nurturing a critical stance towards social realities in students. She uses this phrase in her book called Teaching to Transgress, Education is the Practice of Freedom. In that, she actually writes how what is engaged pedagogy? It's really to see students as whole beings. So they're not only compartmentalized seekers of particular forms of knowledge, but they're also people who are experiencing a whole set of lived realities outside and beyond the classroom. So, I mean, what does it really translate to? That I can't be doing a session on Marxist theory or feminist theory without acknowledging, or maybe even a session on life skills, if it's a non-formal space, without acknowledging that some of these students found it very difficult to get to this college or wherever we are doing these sessions because only one bus flies in the morning, or how crowded it was, or how difficult it was to talk at the scholarship office, or how they've had to fight with their families to come out to your session today. So all of these negotiations are important life experiences shaping what they are experiencing and what they're understanding of what you're trying to offer as critical social analysis. So how can we make those connections between those experiences in the scholarship office, in the negotiations with their families, to what they're beginning to understand about the social world. So I've been stressing this, but all that I'm trying to say is that the self is a product of social experiences, and this is a powerful tool for any critical pedagogy or pedagogy that intends to make young people into critical social analysts. So once I begin to see my own world in relation to social experiences, I am a much more equipped social analyst. Okay, so far I've been emphasizing the experience of the student and the learner and how that is valuable coming into the classroom. I think what's equally true is the teacher or the facilitator in some ways bringing in their own lived experiences as text into the classroom. In fact, Bell Hooks, who I'm drawing from, she talks about how it is often conducive to sharing or engaged pedagogy if she says if teachers take the first risk, sharing how confessional narratives are linked to academic discourses. So if teachers can actually share what's happening with them and how they connect to academic discourses. And I think I'm going to do a little bit of that even in this talk. So I think as a mother of a 2.5-year-old, for me, carving out time for anything, including this talk, is not really easy. But it's not really about childcare alone, right? It's also about childcare arrangements and social expectations of motherhood. I mean, just understanding this makes it easier to accept that one might not always be ideal, but it's okay. And it's essential and absolutely necessary to ask for help in the process. So I'm just doing what I think we can perhaps a little bit do in terms of bringing ourselves in to the extent that we feel safe doing in different spaces, to talk about how our analysis of gender or analysis of, there's a lot being written about motherhood these days and about feminist ideas of motherhood is not really out there. It's really being shaped by each of our experiences. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to take a small pause because that was really the first section where I was trying to lay out what I mean by formal, non-formal, what I mean by the self, and what I mean by engaged pedagogy. Just having laid that out, now I'm going to actually step into the actual ways in which the self can be brought in into learning experiences. And in this, I'll talk about two ways in which the self can be a powerful text, two broad ways. Perhaps there are others, but here I'm talking about two ways in which the self can become powerful. One is, I think, what I've already been hinting towards, which is it can help hone our ability to understand the social world analytically. The second, a sort of self as text can also make the learning of skills a little less intimidating, especially for marginalized students. And I'll come to why and how a little later. So the first part, which is how the self as text can enable us to understand the social world more. Let's think of a few activities. So I think the first is, I think, which is done in many different contexts and locations, is a privilege walk, right? Sometimes it's done with actual people and sometimes it's done with fictional stories. So you hand over different people a character saying who you are. You can be a man from an urban context, from a privileged caste. You can be a woman from an Adivasi context, etc. So either you do that or you work with people who are actually part of your learning space. In the Indian context, what would a privilege walk look like? Maybe some of us are familiar with it, but just so that we're all on the same page, I'm just going to go through the idea of what a privilege walk looks like in practice. So in the Indian context, there might be questions like, have you ever been told that you lack merit or don't deserve to be in an educational site or workplace? Has anyone ever told you that your food is impure? Have you been told that you're unpatriotic because of your religion? Have you been told that you must prioritize the needs of others, especially your family, over your own needs? So at each of these things, if you haven't been told, you step forward. So usually, I think all of us have some understanding of the social world in India. Even in somewhat heterogeneous groups, a walk like this will inevitably mean privileged dominant caste Indians, most often men, are ahead of the line and others behind. It's a tool that powerfully enables one to talk about how, when the starting lines are unequal, it's unfair if we are expected to run the same race. So this can then lead to a lot of conversations about, say, caste and merit in the Indian educational context. Now, the kind of activity that I just spoke about enables an understanding of social selves and privilege relationally. It is empowering, especially for those on the margins of social power structures, to come to view their world structurally. So you realize that some things are not really your limitation. Like, you don't see it as an individual failure, you see it in relation. Okay, now there's another kind of activity, which is not really relational, but it's also about your own self. So an activity that's often done in non-formal learning sites, perhaps not so much in formal spaces, is something like the river of life, where young people map out their critical experiences across different years of their lives. And like, one way of then entering it is to talk about what has shaped all of us over the period of life. And this activity can also help sometimes to recognize patterns. So for instance, if it's a mixed gender group, as young people are sharing, how if many women talk about once they reach 6th or 7th standard, they didn't go out to play anymore, and there were a range of different restrictions that they faced, and how that kind of changed their life. It's quite powerful for the group as a whole to realize, okay, there's a connection to what is happening to each of us and how patriarchy is structuring each of our opportunities. Okay. Okay. Now there's two ways in which something like life journey sharing is powerful. One is it creates a sense of solidarity, especially when safe shared spaces are created and young people realize that some experiences are not only personal, they're also social, or political, in that sense, that though they're encountering it at a personal level, these are a product of larger social realities. So in that context, I'd like to pause to talk about one research study that we did at Samvada, where we were trying to map two critical learning non-formal sites, one of which is also the Livelihood Learning Center of Samvada itself, and another is an academy called Vistar. So where different educators have shared their experience of what does it mean to do critical pedagogy in practice. So, and one of the methods, in fact, we used in that research was also to elicit autoethnographic accounts by facilitators. And one of these accounts, one of the educators actually talks about the story of personal sharing. In a classroom, this young boy shares how he and his sister used to travel across villages to sell flowers. As they were, walking, he tells his sister that, Shine, is there anything?
It's okay now.
Okay. Yeah, just stop me at any point if you think I'm going too fast or you want me to, like, slow down. Yeah, so I just wanted to tell a few like stories to kind of make this a little less abstract. So she tells him that, he tells her that his pocket has a hole and everything's falling off. And then she kind of jokes with him and says, his pocket has a hole, but her dress is filled with pockets, in the sense that her dress is filled with holes, and they both start laughing. He's narrating the story of struggle, but he kind of breaks down because he's repeatedly saying, but we are not poor in this classroom. And the entire class kind of responds to this and sort of, there's a sort of sharing of emotion at that point, but there's also the shared experience of feeling ashamed of poverty. And then the facilitator tries to take over and discusses and questions the shame associated with poverty. Why does one feel the sense of shame, and how does one encounter this? So I'm recalling this particular incident to talk about how there is a certain crucial role that the facilitator needs to play in these processes to kind of, one, ensure that young people are feeling safe, comfortable, and when certain incidents that make them feel uncomfortable come up, that you're scaffolding the process in many ways. but also to say that this is a process through which young people come to reject any sense of inferiority or shame associated with marginalized social locations. And I think I will say this a little later, but it is also about letting go of any sense of pride that you have with respect to privileged locations. Okay. Another important element of sort of self-based reflections is this. Yeah, sorry, I just said this is rejecting the sense of superiority or pride because of one's social location. Okay, so for instance, when you do the privilege walk after an activity like that, the facilitator's role is also to enable the learners to think about why is it that they're at the front of the line? What makes it possible? Not to make them feel bad, because that also sometimes might happen, but that's not the idea, right? The idea is to sort of be able to think about what is it that is enabling you to be ahead. So when someone realizes that they have had it relatively easier, it's not that their life's been easy, but there are certain structural realities that makes it relatively easier for them. It's also empowering learning to reject pride. And I'll recall one instance about rejecting pride. So this is a young person who many months after he finished a course came back to the facilitators and shared with them how some of his fundamental beliefs about caste and gender had been shaken. He had not spoken to his elder sister in several years since she had married outside caste and they were from a dominant caste. And so he had felt that she had violated ideas that he had about honor, etc. So after the course and exposure to various ideas, and he particularly said, hearing a facilitator share about their relationships with their sibling and other talk about difficulties that other people shared about navigating with their families to create relationships of choice, it made him rethink his own decision. And a few months after the course, he actually reaches out to his sister after several years of not having spoken to her. I mean, like, this is a very, like, an instance of something very powerfully changing for the person. This is also, of course, this doesn't always happen, right? This kind of change, but even in the rare instances that it becomes possible, it's very critical. And why is it critical? Why is this understanding linkage between the self and social reality critical? Because this understanding is, of course, empowering for the individual, but it's really this kind of understanding that can enable social change at a larger structural level also. So if each of us begin to somewhere see our lives as a product of what is shaping us, I think it also makes us more empathetic and sensitive to what others are going through. Okay. So I think I said two ways in which the self as text can be used. And I said the first was in relation to social analysis. And what I've been talking about so far is about social analysis. But as you can see, there's a clear connection between our own life stories and the social analysis that I'm trying to talk about. But I had said there is a second way in which the self as text is powerful. And that is, I think, and this I think is particularly important for the marginalized young person, which is in making the learning of skills a little less intimidating. Here I'll talk about English as a language. And I think we all know that there's clear divides of caste, class, urbanity that marks who speaks English, what kind of English, and what kinds of English are demanded in certain upwardly mobile jobs. Yeah, I mean, we know there's histories of colonialism, caste, and there are many ways in which we can, talk about English as a product of all of these histories. But my interest really here is what do educators or critical pedagogues or people who take a critical pedagogy approach to education do when you know that there are people who want to learn English for better opportunities. So, and you have to evolve different ways of doing this. I mean, it's interesting that Aishwarya is here. Maybe there are more conversations that we can have later. But I think it's not only about teaching grammar, syntax, or even spoken English activities that are, more fun. Sometimes it's also very powerful to do simple activities such as an English language focused privilege walk before starting the process of actually learning the language. So for example, did you have access to English books as a young child? Were there people in your family who could speak the language? Did you watch movies in English? Do you speak English with peers or friends? When you realize that some people are speaking very fluently, but they have had access to all of this. And that is why perhaps they are speaking in the ways they do. I think that sense of intimidation about the language is somewhat reduced. And it also enables you to understand histories of caste, colonialism, and the English language, and somewhat reduces the baggage that English comes with. Not entirely, but somewhat, and I think makes it a little less intimidating to learn it as just another language. Similar activities can be imagined for digital skills. I mean, we often talk about how in Samvada, there are young people who come for our various courses who've not actually, I mean, even in today's day and age, have not really touched a computer. So uh, they're not at the same pace as somebody else learning digital skills. So just beginning to understand the opportunities you have had and then saying, okay, this is a skill and I will learn it, I think is a very empowering process. Okay. Having said all of this, I just also want to say that the self as text is important not only in the classroom, but also outside. And mentoring young people to make sense of their own experience and the world around them is a critical part of the pedagogy that we need to think about. Okay, I'm going to now move towards the last section that I spoke about, which is the caution that we must exercise as individuals. I mean, so far I've been talking about the self as powerful, right? The self as text that can be used in various contexts and how it can offer many things to educators and learners. But I now want to emphasize that there is a certain level of caution that both individuals and institutions must take in working with the self as text. The first, and I think a very basic thing is, of course, is to create that safe shared space where learners actually feel comfortable bringing themselves into the classroom. So it's not that you're just doing it for the sake of doing it, but there is a, like, the educators clearly thought through the objective of why are we doing this. And I think one way of also creating the safe space is for the educator to be vulnerable, to be willing to bring their own stories also into the room when we are thinking about sharing stories. The second caution is really to be careful not to compel any sharing. So when we request learners to share, it's not a compulsion, but an option, right? No one is being forced to tell their stories at any point. And I think it's very important that the facilitator is also attentive to ensure that there's no sense of informal pressure that is making young people feel like, okay, everyone's telling their story, maybe I also have to tell it. So I think that kind of a caution is important. The third, and I think this is quite critical, is to be ensure that we're attentive to how some recollections can be triggering, particularly if there have been experiences of trauma. If someone chooses to share these stories, a lot of time, attention, and care will need to be given. So if we have to work by the clock, if we have, institutional constraints, I think accounting for that in terms of bringing these stories in is very important, because otherwise it will be left hanging, and that shouldn't happen. And I think finally, there's also a word of institutional caution, which I think we at Samvada also try to exercise, and all of us working with young people. Of course, the entire talk has been very higher education or youth focused, because that's where I come from. I think the institutional caution is also to be attentive to how stories of individuals are narrated carefully, even in contexts such as these, where we are thinking about pedagogy, where we are very conscious about the confidentiality of learners and educators, even when we are having these conversations. I think with that, I am done with what I wanted to say. And it'll be nice to actually have some reflections on what has been shared so far.
Thank you, Savitha, for that wonderful speech. And I think, you also gave us a lot of prompts to think with. And now I would want to invite, everyone to sort of pitch in, to comment, to offer your reflections. It would be great if you can also just give a sense of your context, because there are people here working in very different spaces and also, I think, from different countries. So I think that would be great too. So yeah. just to start off, maybe I can offer a couple of sort of thoughts that came to my head. And I think, while you were talking in the context of working with marginalized communities and the kinds of, concerns that one should have, I was just thinking of a context where I am teaching, which is in an elite university context. Uh, and there, in that space, when, let's say, the personal story is used, right, to some extent, it's also used because, I mean, there is that disparity of numbers in terms of, where students are coming from. And these are not particularly diverse spaces. Uh, and and the personal story is one way in which, let's say, uh, the dominant sort of communities in this university gets to hear about, right, the perspectives of those who are coming from less dominant or marginalized sort of spaces. However, there are a couple of sort of problems I wanted to just highlight. And one, I've often found that uh, sometimes there is an attempt to claim almost like an equality of disadvantage, right? So if, let's say, there's one person who says that, okay, this is my context and these are the class or caste disadvantages, and people are not even talking in that sociological language often. People are just saying, okay, in my school, these were the issues, or this is the kind of domestic work that I had to do, or some of them also were working as children, and this, as a result, this is my education experience. And then, the next person goes that, oh, even I had such a bad time, and even though they may be coming from sort of class privilege or caste privilege, they might sort of say that, oh, but I had a bad time, because let's say my parents didn't give me enough attention, right? Now, while, I mean, of course, all of them are valid, no doubt, but it sometimes feels like people are not able to like contextualize, their experience vis-a-vis sort of broader power structures. So that's one. And the second sort of issue that I've seen is where there is a performance too, right? So often people want to speak in the language that sounds the most progressive or sounds the most appropriate for the class. And to what extent that's doing some real work, in terms of your own emotional churning, is something I'm unsure about. So just thought of these two sort of issues. Yeah. But others, please, I think some of you raised your hand. So could you please like raise your hand and we'll take more responses.
Would you like me to respond, or we take all the questions together?
Yeah, maybe we can take sort of 2-3 sort of questions at a time. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sakshi, please go ahead.
Hi, Savitha. That was very, very wonderful. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, I really, really enjoyed it.
Academic loads.
Sorry,
And
you
then
mentioned I
yung
should.
funded ed, yung extracurricular at the same time. No class.
Somebody is trying to speak. I can hear someone.
Yeah, Mark, are you trying to say something? I think we can come to you later after this question. Yeah, Sakshi, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. You want me to tell you a bit about my context before I ask my question? Okay. So I work at this organization called Slam Out Loud. I'm a G. Jivisha fellow. I don't know if you know that organization. So I'm a community mental health worker. I am a counseling psychology by profession. So this year I'm a part of a fellowship that works for social change through arts. So right now I'm working in the education setup, but it's more from arts for social change / mental health sort of a context rather than education specifically. So I have two, but community psychology is something that I really feel very passionately about. Decolonial ideas, critical community psychology, art for activism. So I had two specific questions for you, and I don't know if they've got any answers as such, but just wanted to hear your thoughts on it. One is, sometimes I just have this fear that it's some approaches that we might have, they probably will be more ameliorative rather than challenging systems, when oftentimes we need to really critique the system. So I always harbor this fear that what if I am joining these dominant discourses and again perpetuating that oppression, even if I'm well intentioned. So, how does one kind of understand that they're actually critiquing the systems, and also helping the ones who are being oppressed understand that these are systemic issues which need to be critiqued? So, that's one. Um, I have a second question also. Also, in general, sometimes so issues are systemic. So, and within some, it does feel like we don't have the power to change systems. So also, how do you deal with things like that? Because I oftentimes find myself, even in this context, being really overwhelmed because it feels like there are so many issues, and and there's such an intersection of issues, and I feel a lot of hopelessness, and I don't know how to not feel hopeless. So these are my questions.
Thanks, Sakshi. Savitha, would you like to take those questions first?
Yeah. I think I'll respond to Sakshi first, and then Shayan come to what you raised. I think one is I think structural critique has to happen. I mean, but I think the sense of hopelessness is something we need to constantly fight against. Is also part of I think our work as educators, because but because I think there is a sense of hope in that at a very micro. I mean, I might sound I don't know, utopian, but at a very micro level, even in the shifting attitude, shifting perspectives that we can make possible in the classroom, at some level, these are challenges to the structure, right? Like, I mean, they may not necessarily see a dismantling, but I think they're like, small interruptions in systems of power. And I think that is the hope, that there is going to be some interruption of systems of power. I think that's my response. Actually, I don't know if that completely answers the question. Shine, I think I agree with you. I think in a very heterogeneous. I think even in the context that I work in, there is some heterogeneity, and what you're saying does happen. So to some extent, where there is some narration, or where people are almost trying to, I mean, it doesn't necessarily, but can translate into oppression Olympics, right? Like it can be like, I have also experienced this, and you might have experienced that. But I think that's where the facilitator is important. And I think what is also important is the recognition that privilege and marginalization are not absolutes. So you might be privileged in certain contexts and might not be in other contexts, right? Like, so I think just beginning to realize that. But I think there is a value in, I mean, although this entire talk was about the connections between the self and the social, sometimes there's a value to also have spaces where people can just narrate their life experience. We have that amount of time and space without necessarily jumping into the social analysis kind of frame, because you also need to feel centered, grounded, heard out, and validated before you can begin to start thinking of your life vis-a-vis social connections. And even after you have understood your life critically, sometimes you just need to be heard. I think that itself is a very important part of what an educational experience can do for you. But I think there is a risk, like what you said about, especially when it's a mixed group, this need to portray that, okay, maybe you've had some set of disadvantages, but I have had other sets of disadvantages. I think I don't really have a ready answer to that question, but I think in some ways the facilitator will need to think about how to come in there to talk about how, while all of us have struggles, they are not equal struggles. Not because some of us are good people and some of us are bad people. I mean, to make it very simple, like simplistic, but some of us have more access to resources and possibilities than others. I think that's like doing that somewhat gently also, I think, is sometimes necessary.
There are some questions on chat. So Kamna and Ritika have questions, also Hira and Sumita.
Okay.
Kamna and Ritika, would you like to add on anything? Okay, so if I just read out the question, I think Kamna's question is about, I want to address something I personally struggled with, not just as a student, but now
Was
who
it?
face challenges being from a marginalized group, but now as an educator. Um, so there's a constant fear of being dismissed as a non-meritorious professor simply for bringing these perspectives in the classroom.
Yeah. Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think, Kamna, I think in this space, I will also say that for some of us who come from more privileged caste, for me to come from a more privileged caste location, sometimes doing this is easier. And I think the expectation as critical pedagogues should also be a recognition of that. So sometimes maybe for you or for anyone else from marginalized location, it doesn't make sense to be as vulnerable because there are already other sets of. So how much vulnerability one can bring in, whether as an educator or as someone from a marginalized location, is really also something that we have to navigate politically, right? Depending on uh, other privileges that one has had, how much do we want to share? And I think this risk of it's a very real uh, fear. But I don't really have a ready answer to the question because this is not my experience. But I would like to hear from you. So what would you do in terms of, because see, I think there are two things. One is some relative power vis-a-vis the student, right? Because in some ways, as the educator, one has a certain amount of privilege. Structurally, there is whole range of disprivileges and the risk and fear of being dismissed as a non-meritorious professor. So I think those are both very real things. So I don't have an answer. I'm just wondering, how do you navigate this? It's a very tough navigation. I will just admit that it's a tough navigation. Would you like to share something, Kami?
Thank you so much, Savitha, for answering or probably just giving me some pointers to be able to think about it. And I do, realize that as an educator, as a professor, you do have certain, like, there are certain power dynamics between you and your students. But at the same time, within like the current political climate, and I also teach at Delhi University. So again, like students are coming with a very set idea about what merit looks like and how do like what they can use against a professor. So like even when we were younger, when I was during my masters, I mean there were specific ways in which certain professors were approached or like certain kind of comments, caste comments were used against them. So I think what gives me a lot of anxiety is that whole narrative about how how professors from certain backgrounds, like how perceptions are very easy to make around that. And you can't pick up topics like Dalit literature, for example. We do have in English literature as a course, we do have certain Dalit writings that you talk about. And also my research is also on the same. So it becomes really difficult for me to even talk about it. And I feel that there's a lot of self-censorship involved there. So that my research doesn't give away my caste identity. So it feels like a very pressured situation. So I use bell hooks and Paulo Freire to be able to talk about caste, because if I directly do it, it becomes really easy. I mean, for students and sometimes the administration to just like zero you down and then just, I don't know. I just feel attacked a lot of times is what I'm trying to say, and I'm not able to find a way to be able to navigate through like the dynamics that get created in a classroom. And also, since you said that as a professor, like you do have certain power dynamics, but I feel that I don't know why I am not able to tap into that. It's a tricky situation to be in.
Yeah.
So.
No, I must clarify. I think, I mean, while one does have certain amount of power as a professor, I think it's very subject to our caste and gender locations, and it's a very different experience depending on the social location that you come. I have absolutely no questions about it. I think, but I think it's interesting that you have found one way of negotiating this by actually bringing it through Paulo Freire and bell hooks, right? Like, I mean, it's your way of navigating the system, but. I mean, you feel attacked because the system is quite violent. I'm just going to say that. So I think I mean, this is really what we have been talking about, right? The connections between the self and social. And this is you as yourself as the teacher. And thank you for bringing it into this space, because I think that's really what we're saying. Like, which teacher, I mean, even taking that analysis further, which teacher can share the personal story? And which teacher can do it, with more comfort and confidence? I think that those are also questions that we need to be asking. And which teacher has more power? Which teacher can exercise more power? I think it's not an equal landscape.
Thank you so much for taking that up.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kamla. And yeah, any other reflections?
I think there are a couple more questions in
there are a couple more questions too. So I think Ritika has a question. Can you please elaborate more on handling triggers and traumas, especially if the learning space includes people of different age groups and social backgrounds? I work with youth and activists as a gender educator. Ritika, would you like to add on anything?
Hi, no, that was it. I mean, I liked how you addressed this, but can you elaborate more on this?
Yeah. So I think this is something that has also been learning for us at Samvada. We've realized that, we are not always equipped to handle trauma. And so I think there's also a way in which the educator needs to be equipped. And I think one thing that helps is not compelling stories. I think that's a very important caution that we can exercise, even through informal pressures. Like, it's like everyone sharing. So let me also share that shouldn't really happen. But I think it's not like to avoid trauma, but to actually be mindful of what might come up. But when something like that comes up, I think the only way is to give it a lot of time and space. So there are times when our life journey sharing has taken us 3 days, right? So our schedules are going to go off track. Your, timetables are going to go off track. So some way, which is also why I think one should be very careful in even doing this if you don't have that much time and space. Otherwise, keep it very specific to say, okay, in relation to XYZ, what has been your experience? I think that is one way to keep the conversation more limited. And but even then, there might be things that are triggering and traumatic that come up in the classroom. And I think some amount of just giving space, time. I don't really have ready answers because I think we're also evolving ways to handle this. But one thing I will say is a lot of time, space, and attention.
Just to add to this, do you feel that there's a different way of addressing this outside the learning space?
Absolutely.
All right.
I don't think, okay, so let me also say that the learning space is not only the actual learning space, right? Which I think maybe it didn't come across enough in the talk itself. But when I was saying mentoring, it's really about being able to be with the person outside of the formal classroom setup, right? And but I think it's also important, some of it is addressed in the classroom in the sense that they're not made to feel invalidated in any way. I think that sense of validation is very important in that space. But outside the classroom space, one is the facilitator themselves spending more time with the person who's been triggered or trauma has come up. But the other thing I think is also to recognize our own limitations and to see when does this person need to, can you set up a meeting with a counselor? Do they need forms of support that you are, like, to be very honest with yourself about, okay, these are things that I don't know how to deal with. So now what do I do and whom do I refer them to? I think is very important to do as an educator.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I think there are some questions on engaged pedagogy too, which perhaps we can take on in a bit. I think right now there's a question by Asim, who's asking that, could you please suggest how you integrate theory and lived experience together in your context? Asim, would you like to add on anything about your context or where the question is coming from?
Hi, thanks, Savitha, and thanks, Shan and Aishwarya for doing this. Yeah, I teach in a university where, again, it's a mixed kind of a student body, though a large presence of first generation learners coming from disadvantaged class, gender backgrounds, but also from privileged backgrounds. So yeah, sometimes the privilege walk, I find it sometimes difficult to do because it kind of puts the onus on again disadvantaged groups to talk about and sensitize the more privileged students. And yeah, the whole question of whose disadvantage is more can also emerge, or some sense of guilt or those kind of things. I have so yeah, what Kamna was saying, that has also happened where um, mm, yeah, students can be quite aggressive about um, yeah, like the teacher's identity and attack that as well. Um, so yeah, so one way. Also, the other flip side of self-as text is also that this very active practice of reading and engaging with theory can also get a bit sidelined. Um, so yeah, so to how to mitigate all of this together, where one is engaging with yeah, this kind of power dynamics in the class, where, and between the students, between teacher and student in different ways, and also trying to bring some attention to reading theory and connecting it with experience and really seeing them go together rather than yeah, one privileging one or the other. So,
Thanks, Asim. Should we take maybe one more question?
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Aishwarya, I think you wanted to also add something.
Yeah, Shahid, I wanted to, but I feel like I've missed the train. I mean, I wanted to respond to what Kamna was saying, and similar to what Asim is also, I mean, how he phrased this question. I I have also sort of always tried to be this facilitator who's, very self-effacing, to sort of, in a way, bridge that gap between the student and teacher in classroom. And it has worked well in my case because my own location is also loaded with a lot of privilege. So when I do this self-effacing, I'm still seen as, this man of privilege of a certain class. But my partner had a very different take on this. And she said, for a woman, it's always, I want to be seen as someone full of credit, because we operate from different position where credit is naturally denied to us. And, so in that case, it is also a matter of extreme sort of convenience for me to fashion this position as, self-effacing, and I'm letting all in, and I am that instrument through which you can, you know, channel your own thoughts and develop and so on and so forth. But for a woman, she's already, I mean, I can't speak for all women, but for my partner, she's already doing that in all the other sort of scenarios. And classroom is where she comes and wants to be seen as someone who's extremely, extremely serious, an expert, someone with a lot of credit, who's put in a lot of work in her, in her PhD, in her research to be here. So yeah, so I just wanted Savitha's thoughts.
Yeah, I think, Shayan, I'd like to respond to what Aishwarya and Asim said together. I think, yeah, so I think, in fact, even when I was discussing this talk in Samvada, and I spoke about one way in which the self in the classroom can be brought in, and I said, and I have often said that, it's important that the teachers will also be vulnerable. Many of my colleagues contested this and said that, it's probably easier for you to say that, because it's easier for you to bring in yourself and still be seen as quote unquote meritorious, right? Like somewhat similar to what Aishwarya is saying. I mean, it's not only about women, it's about caste, it's about, a lot of other things. But I think it's really a call for every educator to take. I'm not going to say that the only way to bring the self as text is to put yourself out there. I think depending on the power structures, one might choose not to do it. But I want to say something that I think, can we also start questioning what a serious professor looks like, or a person who who's knowledgeable looks like, because really that's what we're getting to, right, at the core of it. And I think I had one more sort of a response to what Asim was saying. Like, I think the privilege walk and what it does, and placing the onus on the disadvantaged student, I think that we can shift. I think somewhere can the onus of the privileged walk at the end of the day be on the person. And we tried to do this in Samvada. So we've asked people who are sort of ahead of the line to look back and say, what is it that makes, why do you think you are where you are? And a lot of young men, men from, I will say this, these are men from Muslim and Dalit contexts, from vulnerable obesity contexts, have been able to tell us exactly why they are ahead of some of the women they're ahead of. So like they're able to articulate it. And I agree that with Asim, that it's not like this is an activity that's an end in itself, right? But it is also useful and powerful as an experience that then gets you to read, right? It's also then you begin to realize that a lot of people have, for instance, read Ambedkar after these processes because they felt like there are things that they want to understand. So I think one need not, but I think again, it's about how the learning is structured. There was a question in the chat box that I thought was important, which said, with all respect to engaged pedagogy, how is this structured? So I just wanted to make it clear that it's not like the entire curriculum and pedagogy only revolves around the self, right? In fact, in most of Samvada's learning experiences, we work with what we call the 3 pillars. So there's the self, there is skills and perspectives. What we are only saying is there is a link between the 3, right? The self being who you are, and by perspective, we really mean readings, theoretical engagements, being able to see beyond your own life experiences. It includes being able to read Bama, it includes being able to read Meena Kandaswamy. It's about big, and I think sometimes the self activities related to the self actually get you wanting to read more, because then you realize ki there is a connection to what is happening to me and what is happening in the world out there. So yeah, so it's not like the self is the only focus, is something that I wanted to clarify, but a self is an important thread across the various kinds of learning experiences that one might have.
Can I also just share a little experience from teaching? So I was teaching at Jamia, and Jamia is a central university that has a very sort of a diverse, what you call multicultural cohort, and people, especially from a lot of disadvantaged groups, they come in, and so there is a general sort of an agency and understanding of what an English student is, which is to be have a certain access to critical vocabulary, and talk about how they are oppressed, right? And especially in the aftermath of CAA and the protests that happened, and all the violence, there was a lot of futility of doing things. And it was, for me, a sort of, in classroom, the most articulate student, who's also a boy, a man, he said that, why do we do this if there is no future, and there's so much futility and all of that. And I sort of wanted to also impress upon them that we are also very privileged. We are coming to this university amongst so many other people who don't get to come to this university, and we can also give something back, right? So we don't necessarily have to venture out in this direction where we think that all our intellectual input should be put in vocalizing our oppression and articulating in the most theoretically relevant way, but also giving out something more than that, and using this as a way of also thinking about our privilege of being here in the first place. There's a student who's gone to DPS in Srinagar, and they've experienced all sorts of problems, but yet they are here, yeah, right? So when they're here, they also have something more to give. And this is a common sort of an experience amongst all of us, that we all are at a certain margin, when we come to this university, we all experience that. Right? I mean, and it starts with you entering the gates of the university where the guard just doesn't recognize you and wants your ID card to see if you are, a student or a teacher or whatever. So, I mean, there are many sort of, these avenues of experiencing marginality. And I mean, that's just an example. But we can also give as and that is a very productive way of thinking about the location of self when we start to give and when we start to incorporate that as a practice. So students were trying to like help out PhD students are trying to help out researchers, and all of those things started happening. And now I'm really curious to see what that student would say. I mean, in terms of the fertility.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I have a very small response. Can I go ahead or like?
I think there were some. I think Hera, you had
Hera,
your
yeah.
hand raised. Would you like to? Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Savitha. It was a great, honestly, it was a great session. This is the first time I'm attending something with respect to like unstructured pedagogy. And it's really a new concept for me. I'm actually working with various NGOs, and with respect to that, it's very helpful, honestly. But at the same time, when you said that the facilitator, when they get involved and they share their own stories, and through that they try to find out certain solutions, but what happened, like when there is a certain level of trauma sharing, or a certain level of engagement happens, there's a need to balance it out, like, because thing is, like, we have to engage with the children, as well as at the same time we have to make a little distance also. Like sometimes it's just like we get overly engaged and there's no solution to it, and we just go haywire and there's nothing happening, and the trauma of the children is might be just like coming from like suppose a child is coming from a family which is like the child has faced domestic abuse, and the facilitator is also having the similar problems in the house or something. So if there's a certain with respect to NGO I'm talking about, so it's like if there's an engagement happening with the child and the facilitator, and if the engagement is not drawn, what is that spot, like how to draw that, like, okay, you wouldn't get overly involved, but at the same time you want to engage with the children also. So I believe it's a quite a sketchy slope. Yeah, thank you so much, Savitha, and thank you, Shan, and everybody. It was for arranging all that. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one thing, which was also at the back of my mind. I mean, just to add on to the question. So one is about, let's say, how do you engage? And I think here there's a question of like, what is the responsibility also of the facilitator towards that person? But I'm also thinking that, there is a kind of emotional effect on the facilitator too, to be sort of empathizing and understanding trauma of not just, many people at a time. And so like, just curious to know like your sort of view on this, Savitha, like what is the emotional navigation that you do, or how do you do it? Yeah.
Begin by saying okay, I'll answer Shayan's question first because it's a very important one. So after we have had a set of, like, at least in the context that I work in, like after any set of facilitators have done self sessions, we need a little break, right? Like, because it's quite demanding of you, right? And it's not always because you're sharing your own story, but even like the fatigue of having to be there and listen in person to a range of different stories can be quite tiring. I think a couple of things I wanted to clarify, because I think this is coming up multiple times. One is, I think I'm definitely not saying that the facilitator always brings their stories or always brings their self. I think, and I think this is very important in relation to what also what Asim and Kamna brought up. But I think and I think it's also a strategic choice sometimes, right? Like where you want to bring yourself in, how much you want to bring yourself in. And I think that's a power we should retain as educators navigating systems that are not always equal. But what I was only trying to say is sometimes, and if the facilitator feels safe enough, there might be a space for bringing in one's own story. That's part of it. But responding to what Hira said, I think I have one important caution. I think working with children is very different. And I haven't really worked with children. So I don't think whatever I'm sharing can be extrapolated to children very easily. I'm really working with we call youth, and most of them are above 18, right? So in the age ranges of maybe 19 to 30, 35. So I think with children, the context is different. And I think with children, maybe it's much more important to make them feel heard. I actually haven't worked with children, so I'm not really equipped to think about it that much. I just understand that it's a very different kind of course, some things might be the same. You want to create a shared space, you want to make them feel heard and validated, etc. But what stories are possible? Like for instance, in the specific instance that you gave, Hera, I definitely don't think it would be right for the facilitator to bring in her experience of abuse when a child is talking about. I think that's like taking away the child's space. So I think that's the other big caution about bringing in the self, especially when the facilitator is more privileged vis-a-vis the people that we are educating or learning with, right? So there's also the risk of your story somehow becoming more important in that context. And I think avoiding that is important.
Are there any more reflections and responses?
Yes.
Something in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah, Tabriz, go ahead.
Okay, I have 3 points. One is in late 19th century, many autobiographical literature emerge, and one of the, the purpose was pedagogical, meaning if I have achieved this, you can also do this. And the second story is through my personal experiences in the classes. Many teachers used to narrate stories that I have been subjected to this to achieve this. So you also had to bear my authority. And the third, narrative, let's say, for example, for my personal experiences, I have been subjected to a lot of challenges, a lot of things that I don't want to be followed by others. So I don't want to be used my personal experience as examples to be followed. So I wanted to, connect all three stories into one theoretical, whatever, I don't know. Can you shed some light on that?
Tabriz, so all three connect. You want to complete that thought? Like connect all, like you said. So
I wanted to say how to look at it. If all you're talking about the location of a teacher, so what teacher should do in your class, in your classes. But my point is how teachers also shaped and also shaping through their own experiences, and using their own experiences to torture others in some cases, because I have been suffered to this, you also have to suffer this because it's the only way out. And I just said like in case of the autobiographical literatures that have emerged in late 19th century, and the purpose was, one of the purpose was pedagogical, and encouraging others to do, like, if I have done this, achieve this goal, you also can do this. And third is, I, as a educator, I don't want my experience to be followed because I don't think my experience is the ideal ones.
Okay. I think it's a very important point, because I think when the self can be brought in also to make a very unjust classroom, right? I think that's what I kept talking about the self as text and powerful, and how it can probably enable social critical analysis in the pursuit of social justice. But I think what he said now is something that happens across Indian classrooms at all levels, right? Where teachers are like, how, for instance, I'm just using like a loose example, like how strict my teachers used to be, and I'm very lenient with you kind of ideas. So so you were a product of oppression, and you're still oppressive, but little less oppressive than what you experienced. So how do I get, right? Like in the sense, I think what Tabrez is saying is important, and I think it is an important point to clarify. The idea is not simply that I narrate myself. If I am narrating myself in the pursuit of a more just classroom, I mean, I think Bell Hooks says this in some context, that if we are moving towards a certain world, if we want to be moving towards a certain world, our classrooms also must reflect at least the practices that we want to hope for in that world. So in that sense, if I'm narrating my story to further oppression in some ways, then it's unjust. And I think there shouldn't be space to do that. I will go as far as to say that.
I think we can take our final set of reflections if there are any, because we'll have to now wrap up in around 10 minutes. So, are there any more thoughts and reflections?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, Adra, go
Hello.
ahead.
Yeah,
Hi.
so actually, hi, sir. So before joining to this, I thought that it's all about the students in classroom, especially the school setups. So I was thinking how this non-formal classroom. So I was imagining it's a non-formal interactions that's happening. But yeah, things are totally different. You're talking about youth and uh, especially of a different age. So actually, I was thinking, how is it possible to bring the self and experiences and things to classroom since I'm working on school education? Yeah.
I'd actually like to invite if anyone else wants to respond to that, like somebody who's worked in school education or worked with children, because like I said previously, it's really not something I've done. I think some things might be similar, except especially in terms of validating young people. But this is really like the context I'm talking about is really where you're working with young people and young people in whom we are trying to develop certain critical social perspectives. I think that's the context. So it's like either formal social sciences or non-formal social sciences in higher education, I think is really where this set of reflections were coming from.
I mean, theoretically, I wanted to say like personal stories as a text is also inherently structured, right? So if you narrate your personal stories, it's not like free from the structural biases, structural, operations. That was my,
Yeah, I agree. So I think even when, say, young people from marginalized communities are sharing the story, they're not doing it in relation to structure, right? They're first just telling the story as to what is happening. So, and I think there's space to do that. But eventually, I think it's the role of the facilitator to also guide and mentor the connection. And I think that is where, going back to Asim's thing about what is the linkage to theoretical understanding becomes important. So you're not only like realizing certain things about, like initially you're just telling your story like anybody does, right? You're narrating what happened when you were in school, or how a certain teacher spoke to you. I'll just share a couple of things. I think that would I don't know if you have the time, but I'll just share one thing. Okay. So like some of the young people who come to us often talk about how humiliating it is, especially for young people who come from SC/ST categories in school, when books or scholarships are distributed when you're asked to get up. And now that's a personal form of humiliation. But the more you begin to understand caste, you also see that this humiliation is not just a product of what happened to you, but a product of sort of realities. So when you initially tell the story, you're not necessarily making that linkage, but that is the education also that I'm talking about. That linkage is what you learn over time to do.
I know we just have just a little time, but what Savitha had also asked, like if there's anybody here from a school sort of space, or if you're working with younger children, because this question has come up a couple of times. So if there's any insight you would like to share on that, please go ahead. Okay, I think that brings us sort of to the close of this session and to the conclusion of this session. I have shared a feedback form, and it would be great if you could, fill that up. So if you have any thoughts that you couldn't like express right now, but you would still like to put out, and we can forward that to Savita, and we can just keep the conversation going. And I think some people asked for readings on engaged pedagogy. So Savita, if it's possible for you to share anything, we can then forward it to those who registered. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending the session, and thank you, Savita, so much for taking out your time. And we hope to continue these conversations going ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing and inviting.